Welcome to a show about death, episode 3. Today we're going to talk about the Greek god, or gods of death, Thanatos. Now, a lot of people think Hades is the god of death, but Hades is actually the god of the dead, which is very different. Right? Thanatos is the god of death itself. Specifically, however, Thanatos is the god of peaceful death. He actually has sisters, the Kiri, I believe they're called, that are gods of violent death, things like murder. Now, Thanatos has the brother, Hypnos, who's the god of sleep. Right. Now, death in Greek mythology is kind of weird, right? Because first you die, and depending on how you died, you then have to deal with either Thanatos coming to collect your soul, or the Kiri coming to snatch your soul. Either way, you have to your soul gets taken and passed to Hermes, who delivers your soul to Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, who once you pay him a coin, ferries your soul across the river Styx, where you're then judged by the council to decide whether or not you go to I don't remember what it's called, the fields, something. And then you have, which is basically like a neutral ground. If you did pretty okay, you'll go to the field, and which is akin to just another life on Earth, another life, and then after many years there, you'll be bathed in the river Lethe. You'll be wiped clean in the river Lethe and be reborn. If you did terrible things in your life, you'll be sent down to Tartarus, effectively their version of hell, where you'll be tortured, basically. And if you did really good things in your life, you'll be sent to Elysium, basically their version of heaven. Now, it's really interesting that there are so many steps in the process of death in Greek mythology. But most people just put it all under Hades, the god Hades, because the underworld as a whole is also called Hades. It's a bit confusing. Now, it's quite interesting that Hades, as a god, the god Hades, is generally also, much like Anubis, generally considered evil, even though he's actually quite an altruistic god. It is actually overall more moral than his brothers Zeus and Poseidon. Like, Zeus was a terrible person who did a lot of fucked up shit. But Hades, despite somewhat kidnapping his wife and effectively tricking her into eating a pomegranate, despite effectively kidnapping his wife Persephone and tricking her into eating a few pomegranate seeds to keep her in hell, he was actually very faithful to Persephone, and treated her quite well outside of the whole meeting. And even then, he in fact had permission to take Persephone from her father Zeus, which was allowed at the time, right? Fathers had the right to marry off their daughters. And well, effectively, that's what he did. The problem came when Zeus decided not to tell Persephone's mother. Demeter, the goddess of nature and growth, or not nature, goddess of crops. Demeter demanded that Persephone be returned. A lot of people have heard the story. Demeter demanded that Persephone be returned, so Hades tricked Persephone into eating a few pomegranate seeds, forcing her to return to hell for 3 months out of the year. And this is what we know as winter, because Demeter, the goddess of growth, becomes sad, and therefore no crops and stuff will grow during the time that Persephone is with Hades in hell. Or in with Hades in, well, Hades. In the underworld. Now, it's very interesting that Hades, much like Anubis, was also often misunderstood as an evil being, when he's really actually not. Hades is actually very altruistic. And Anubis is also, quite a kind, as a protector god, and I think it's really interesting how gods of death tend to be viewed as evil, even though they're not. Because people fear the inevitable. Now, we'll talk more about the fear of the inevitable, the fear of death, in later episodes. So we're going to put that aside for now. But effectively, people fear Hades because they fear the inevitable. They fear their deaths. And therefore, they view Hades as in a more negative light, which results in him being misunderstood as, well, wicked or evil. And I think that's pretty unfair, you know? Now, Thanatos, the god of death, the one who actually takes the soul, is supposedly a fairly handsome young man with large wings. And occasionally carrying a scythe. Thanatos, in fact, was a large portion of the inspiration for the more modern Grim Reaper, which I think is interesting. Thanatos was a large chunk of inspiration for the more modern Grim Reaper. I think that's very interesting, right? He was generally known as a relatively kind soul who was very... He was often kind to the souls that he ferried. Like, there was the king Sisyphus, who, when Thanatos dragged him down to brought his soul to the underworld, was about to was about to chain him up in the underworld. Sisyphus asked a request. He requested that Thanatos show him how the shackles worked, and Thanatos agreed. Sisyphus managed to trick Thanatos into shackling himself, therefore trapping him, and making it so that death could no longer happen for a time. And well, that's an almost somewhat that's a somewhat ridiculous story. Well, that's a somewhat silly story. The fact that that Thanatos was kind enough to indulge a dead man's request, even though he was quite the wicked man, shows that Thanatos was actually quite a kind god. I feel like I'm rambling here. So, I think I've left you with a pretty solid idea of, well, a solid description of, well, the gods of death in Greek mythology. So, I suppose for now I'll leave you with the simple question. What is death?